Welcome to the Virtual CPA Success Show, where we're 100% focused on helping service-based businesses achieve success. Are you a business owner interested in learning how to scale your business? Has your business reached over $1 million in annual revenue? Then this podcast is for you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. I'm very excited for today's topic. It is a topic that is pretty much relevant any time of year, any year. We're always thinking about changes, and so today we're bringing in Douglas Ferguson from Voltage Control, who knows a lot about change and works with companies on change. So, welcome to the show, Douglas, and would love for you to give a little bit of introduction about your background and your company.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as Jamie mentioned, founder of Voltage Control, and we're a change agency, which means that we help organizations navigate change and actually thrive through change. A lot of times folks see change as something that's like, oh, we had to wade through it, or it can be so much of a struggle just to be stuck in that messy middle. It's going to be frustrating and difficult. And we believe it can be a time to thrive. And especially in these uncertain times we're in, change just begets more change. It begets more change, right? And so, how do we look at it as something where we can thrive? And so, we help people navigate those moments and also build the skills that it takes to look at future changes with less fear.
Awesome. In addition to Douglas, we have Jody here. So, Jody, welcome to the show again.
Yep. Thanks, Jamie.
And I know you're someone who loves change and strives for change and is always thinking about change. So I'm excited to have you in the show. And I'm going to actually let you give Douglas the first question because I've worked with you long enough to know change. So.
Yeah. So obviously you can't be afraid of change, right? So change has got to be something you've got to be able to embrace. And, with a lot of people, that's just not the case. Change is something that they kind of hide from. They kind of, push off. And there's tons of excuses or reasons why they don't want to make change. And so, with that, what's a healthy middle? Because obviously you don't want to make change to make change. That doesn't make sense either, but you want to make reasonable change. And so how would you feel like a healthy medium of a person with change, dealing with change?
I think a lot of it has to be started through exploration, because if we don't start with a mindset around exploration and learning, then we don't really know what we're walking into, right? And to your point, if we're just changing for the sake of changing, then we're not coming from an informed perspective. And we can't always have all the data. We're not always operating from a 100% clear, this is how this is going to unfold perspective. But I think it's really important to constantly be evaluating, exploring, learning what we can learn. And then also realizing that, especially if we're dealing with a large staff, that's where change really becomes very difficult, because to your point, we're going to have folks that are really excited for the change, and we're going to have folks that are like really struggling with the change, and we're going to have some folks that are actively opposing it. And so how do we navigate? What's the strategy of how we're going to lean into that? And how are we inviting conversations to really hear from folks to understand what's blocking it? And I'll say the number one thing we run into is identity. People, identities are at stake when we are moving through quite a lot of change.
What do you mean by that? Identities at stake? I'm not following you on that.
Yeah. So imagine that, let's say AI is like all in the news these days, right? And so that's an easy one to capture some fears, because it's still quite uncertain for a lot of us, right? And so if you think about, we're going to introduce some AI capabilities into this new software suite that's going to basically automate all audits. Well, if you're an auditor, then your sense of identity is in question. Because what does it mean to be an auditor in a world where we've got software that automatically does it for us, right? But the thing is we have to unpack it and say, what does that mean? We had to have that conversation, that dialogue, and explore that future. And the people that are eager for the change probably see it. They probably can't articulate it. They certainly haven't visualized it. And we create moments where people can come together, and the people that are excited for the change can slow down enough to like have and provide ways for them to communicate to the others, so they start to see it and go, oh, wait a second, I can reimagine who I am. And it's a transformation they have to go through, right? Because you can't just flip a switch and have them go from I'm an auditor to I'm a XYZ, or I'm a on-prem engineer and now I'm a cloud engineer. There's like, it's just a totally different mindset shift that people have to learn about and reimagine and rethink who they are.
So you talked about the learning, and then obviously with what you just mentioned, how do you find that line of when to do that learning? So I think whenever you're making a change, there's kind of two directions you can go. You can go of, okay, we're going to include everybody in the company in this decision, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to do everything, and we're going to spend months making sure this is the right decision. Or you can just make the decision and say, deal with it, people. So I guess what's the fine line between those two, and how do you determine what's the right amount of people to bring in ahead of time to make sure that the change is right?
Personally, I'm a big fan of creating a culture where everyone's curious. So we get people to the point where they're constantly asking themselves, hey, how can this be better? Or is this serving us? The worst is when we have processes that are so mature and so established that we hold them sacred and we won't let go of them. But at the end of the day, they're not serving their function anymore, right? They're actually a disservice. They're slowing us down. They're just there for the, it reminds me of the movie Office Space, where it's like the TPS report, right? It's like, what are these TPS reports we have floating around our companies that we could kind of creatively destruct? And I think that if we breed a culture of curiosity, everyone's constantly having those conversations. So it doesn't create this moment of like, oh my gosh, we had to bring everyone in and do a giant survey. I don't believe those pulse surveys work. I think it has to be a continuous, healthy habit of being curious and learning and creating those opportunities to flex. And that gets into other cultural things where, if everyone's overloaded, where they're running at the max, then there's no slack in the system for them to thrive and innovate and think in these ways. And definitely on the spectrum of like, hey, this is the change we need, and you're going to have to go deal with it. To like, hey, let's just constantly be changing all the time. Or like, I think if we just create, if we find ourselves in the middle where we created a culture where change can kind of emerge, and people are allowed to create local solutions to their problems, and then we can double down on the things that are working. It's like, okay, look what Susan did over here. This is really cool. This is a great prototype of how we might do it. But now when we pick this up and look at it over in this other department, or we think about how it might work with if we start doing this for this client or that client, then we might have to change it or adapt it or evolve it. And so that's when we bring in other people to the conversation and kind of percolate it out.
So basically, it sounds like you want to go from a small group outward. Then is what I'm hearing. If you get too big of a group, then everybody's just kind of numb to that change, or numb to making a decision, or numb to delaying it because of whatever reason. Whereas a very small group, you can decide what you want to do, and then you want to then broadcast that change amongst everyone else, but then giving them the option or autonomy to actually make minor changes to that as their department needs or their department wants. Is that what I'm hearing correctly?
Yeah, I think what happens is you have a bottoms up and a top down, I would say symbiotic relationship, right? Because if leadership isn't supporting from a structural standpoint and from a resource standpoint and from even just like a cultural mindset point, like these grassroots movements can't happen, right? But if we try to just command everything and puppet everything from the top, that's not going to work either. So I think what we have to do is think about it like this. Leadership should think of themselves as gardeners, right? I can't make that plant grow, but I can create the conditions by which the plants will thrive. And the plants have to find their local optimizations, right? Like if the sun's not quite shining where they need it, and the plant starts to grow toward the sun, right? Like it locally modified and adapted. And then, that's how these systems evolve, right? But we have to tend, and we have to, as leaders, provide those conditions and to allow them to do those things.
I think it's a great point, because I think it goes back to action, right? Like I think a lot of companies and a lot of businesses and a lot of leaders like say, this is who I am, but it's like saying I'm a gardener, but I've never actually planted a plant in my life, right? So I think that if you want to have that culture of, okay, we're going to be curious and we want everybody to bring ideas to us, yet every time someone brings an idea to you, you shut it down and all ideas come from you, then it's never going to work. So I think that you really have to live out that core value if that's what you're gonna do. Is like, hey, this idea was brought to us by Bob, who's a web designer, and he brought this idea of a process improvement. Let's go down this path, and this is what we're going to do going forward. And I think that as long as you're embracing it, that it naturally comes, because people are like, hey, if Bob brought that idea, maybe next time I bring an idea to leadership, they're going to let me do it as well. And so I think it really is about action and not just saying, hey, I'm a gardener. You have to actually live it out.
I think there's two things there too, which is really examining where ideas go to die in your organization. Like, how are they getting squished? Some people talk about the frozen middle, or you just mentioned leadership shooting down the idea. Like, where does it happen? And then how can we have an intervention where we say, let's prevent that from happening? Because we can't just bring in best practices from elsewhere. We have to look at like where it's breaking down for us organizationally. And it's also easy to repeat a mantra where we're like, we're going to let ideas flourish. It's like, okay, great. But if we don't go in and examine, and it's like what Drucker used to say, what gets measured gets managed, right? And so if we don't measure where the ideas are getting stifled, we have no chance of fixing it, right? Because we had to understand that point.
So what about for the person like myself, where I'll come to the table with a lot of different ideas, and I'll go to a meeting or I'll go to a conference and I'll hear these great 3 different things or 4 different ideas that I'd want to implement right away into the company. And then when I come back to the meeting and I talk about it, then of course they get shot down or they get, stifled in some manner. Great ideas, but they don't get any further than that. At what point should a leader continue to push for that change or for those new ideas, or at what point should they say, hey, this is not the right timing, or not the right place, or not even a good idea? How does that? How should that process actually flow?
Yeah, so in that case, if I understand it correctly, it's like the leader is at a conference and the leader's bringing an idea that we heard, and I think
and nobody else.
If the leader's experience,
nobody's heard about the idea, right? So when you bring it in, the leader's been thinking about it for 3 or 4 days, how great this is, heard everybody else talk about how great this is, brings this idea to the table, and then gets shot down left and right for obvious reasons.
Yeah. There's a number of things that might be at work there. One is, again, if we built a culture around kind of protecting the way things are done, and we haven't built a culture of curiosity and creating a space of the safety to experiment, then it's it's like the antibodies of the organization are coming in, and it's less about those people and how they really, really feel deep down. And it's more around they're kind of playing the roles that we kind of taught them to play. They've been conditioned to respond that way. And so sometimes you have to have the conversations to break that down. And I think as a leader, something to experiment with is when you bring these things in, if they are getting shut down, like really drilling into like really what the opposition's about. And also say, hey, here's the other thing. I've really loved to like treat everything like a prototype. Because if we come in and we say, oh, this is the best idea possible, and we got a culture where people are used to shooting down things, they're like, oh, here's a target,
Right.
They're like, they're ready, right? They're like, oh, here's an incoming, and so if you come in with the humility of like, I'm not sure about this, it sounded interesting, but there might be something good here. Can you help me figure out what's good about this, or like what we could learn from it? Then it frames it of like, we should do this. And then now they're like, oh man, we're going to have to change everything. This is going to be a pain in the butt. But like, it shifts the perspective around encouraging them to pull out the good bits. Like, what do they like about it? And then go, okay, well, based on what you like about it, what could we start doing? So instead of importing something from somewhere else, it's like trying to cherry pick the good bits. And then the other thing that I'll say too, and this applies to both scenarios where we were talking about before, and what you're mentioning here is small risky bets can be really powerful, because when a bet is so big, that's when the antibodies really come out, right? Like imagine you don't have as strong of immune system if you scuff your knuckle, right, and it doesn't bleed. But like you get a gash that requires stitches, like there's a big response. There's a lot of swelling. There's a big reaction, and so organizations are very similar, right? They're gonna react based on the threat, how big the threat is. And so if we minimize that threat and if we make it small enough, the potential risk is much smaller, right? Because that blast radius, that potential damage is contained. But let's make it really, really risky, because the riskier it is, the more we can learn. So anytime we're doing a little experiment or test or trying something new, let's actually swing for the fences. But let's do it in a way that's not going to damage the business in a big way. Like we can undo it if we make a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, because I think a lot of, like you said, every idea doesn't have to be a home run, right? Like sometimes the small little change will really make a big difference. So I'm going to piggyback off Jody's question a little bit here, because I think Jody and I experienced some of the same things, and I could tell with his question is I think when I started at Summit, we were probably 20, 25 employees, and so a lot of the ideas were coming from a couple of the CFOs, Jody, Adam, and I, and we were just generating a lot of the change. And I think as we've gotten larger, and now we're part of an even larger firm in the last 6 months or so, I think that one of the obstacles to this is, I'll bring a change in and I'll be like, hey, this is what we should do. And you don't realize that 50 other changes are already happening, because we've built a culture, like you said, okay, we're not the only ones bringing ideas and changes anymore. So can you talk a little bit about how change management needs to change as the company gets larger?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one thing you're speaking about is just kind of maintaining your portfolio of change, right? And so
Exactly.
however you want to track it, everyone has different project management tools, and depending on and this may vary across the organization. If agencies are a special breed, because in an agency, no matter how, everyone's kind of, even as you grow and get really, really huge, pretty much everyone's of the same ilk, right? But you go and look at I don't know, like a software company or CPG or something, and there's so many different departments and roles that get quite big, right? And a lot of times those departments will have their own mechanisms for project management or their own little tools, or sometimes it's not even a very good tool. Like it might be email or something. And so it's I think listening to some of your peers around how they're doing it can be really powerful, because we might already have licenses to some project management tool, whether it's Asana, a Trello, or whatever. But I think tracking those things, so we at least, I love this. I mentioned Drucker's what gets measured gets managed, and I have a similar saying that what gets visualized gets velocity. And so anytime we can see progress, that begets more progress, right? And so that's one of the things great project management tools can do, is really kind of surface up the project. And so I don't really care what tool it is, as long as we can visualize what's happening really quickly. And so I'm a big fan of whenever tools have a Kanban view where you can kind of visually see the arc of progress, really powerful, because that tells us if we've got too much work in progress. And so I would say any of this kind of change management work should be treated with lean methodology kind of mindset. So if we got too much work in progress, it can grind stuff to a halt, because, hey, we just overloaded everything. And that's something you had to experiment with around what is the right amount to have in progress as far as what's healthy. But when you get there and you've got too much, you can feel it, right? And if you've got a way to visualize it, then you can kind of, it helps quantify, it helps see it, and you can kind of back off that edge a little bit.
The one thing we've done in that area is not only have we measured it, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we are a very change company. We love change. We think about change. We're always trying to change. And so one of the things that we did, probably when we were around 30, 35 people, Jody, is we actually hired project managers because of that. Again, we needed more than just a tool of, let's put all our changes into this tool and everybody watch them. We needed someone to actually watch it, and someone who's really good at project management to be able to push back at us because, like I said, Jody and I just love change. Like, hey, we should do this, and we need someone that had that project management in mind. Be like, yeah, we can do that, but just so you know, it's like 15th on the list of all the projects we're working on. And so, if you want to move it up, some of these other projects are going to have to stop. And so that's one thing that we've done. Which again, I doubt there's very many CPA firms out there that have project management. That's something we had to do in order to really get our hands around that that change management that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'll say this. This is an old agile adage that that's came out of QA, and it was this idea that if everybody owns quality, nobody owns it. Because there were organizations that didn't have QA staff, right? And they were just saying, oh, well, everyone should be responsible for quality because we care about quality. But at the end of the day, to your point, if everyone's like ultimately responsible for it, and we're just looking at this tool, who's going to be sweating the details? Who's going to be staring at it, making sure it's accurate and noticing things? And so whether it's in a formal title of project manager or if it's just people that are identified, because I think whether or not you own the role, someone needs to embody the role to like really be identified as the go-to person to get questions answered and to kind of steward that progress.
100% agree with that. I think creating systems and so forth is the same thing. When you're creating systems, you have to do the same thing. Everybody can write down everything that they do and map everything out in detail, but you really need somebody that is going to be the person that's in charge of that. Someone taking that lead. Being the person that's overseeing it, pushing it, making sure that it's all consistent. Across the board. And without that, you'll never create your systems processes. You'll never systemize everything to where you need to be. So I think that's all part of the change management, is having somebody focused and responsible for it. Somebody that's leading it. I 100% agree with you.
You brought up a pet word of mine, which is systems. Big fan of systems thinking, and anyone who's a fan of complexity theory has already noticed that I've been kind of pointing out a few different complexity theory things. But in systems, and funny enough, that's where I got the name of Vulture Control, because I have a massive modular synthesizer. And back when I was a chief technology officer, I would often remark on how patching up my synthesizer was a lot like working with teams. Because if I just move one little cable or turn one little knob, it can have a ripple effect throughout the whole organization, and it reverberates back and forth. And it's like, oh, wow, that little tweak had a massive impact. And that's the way systems work, right? And we have to really respect these phenomenons. And so it requires a bit of care and a bit of understanding. And we shouldn't take those things lightly. And, we have this diagram we like to show in our facilitation training, which depicts the amount of connections between people, the more and more people you add into a meeting. But this also applies to organizations, right? You've got 2 people, there's 1 connection. You got 3 people, there's 3 connections. You got 4 people, there's the connections are just exponentially increasing, right? until it gets unmanageable, right? And so how do you measure and understand these network dynamics, as well as all the other impacts of the systems that are at play? And I think we won't always get it right. We can't always afford. I mean, if you're going to hire someone like Peter Gray from UVA to come in and do a massive network analysis, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars, even for like a medium-sized business. You're not going to do that for every change, right? But I think being aware that these things have impacts and staying curious, we won't always get it right, but being aware of it's huge, because when something doesn't respond as we expected it, we're not apt to blame people or just be frustrated. We're like, oh, okay, the system responded in a way that it was unexpected. Let me try this instead. And so that's kind of like in complexity theory, we talk about probing the environment and seeing how it responds. And so it's like, I think that's a good mental model to carry into these situations.
I think that's really good too. I think, you kind of talked about the network connections. I think what I think about there is, when I think about my team is when we do a change, and obviously Summit's going through a pretty big change now with the merger we're doing, but I can't talk to every senior accountant to see how they're feeling, right? I could, but it would take a little bit more time. So like what I need to know as a leader is who is going to have the best understanding of how the senior accountants are feeling about this, who's going to have the best understanding of how the CFOs are feeling about this, who's going to have the best understanding of where the CFOs are feeling about, or the auditors are feeling about this. So I could just go to 3 people as opposed to trying to go to 100 people. So I think really understanding how those network connections work helps you understand change and really get the picture of what's going on, because I have no clue, because I'm not doing the work of what this means for our senior accountants, right? I don't know what a senior accountant's day looks like now that we're merged with Anders versus what it looked like 6 months ago. But if I went to the accounting trainers who works with them every day and asked them how it's changed and just talk to 1 or 2 of them, they might be able to give me the right picture of, okay, this is changing them a lot more than you think, Jamie, or actually this hasn't changed them at all. So kind of, I think understanding those network connections is really important to be an effective.
Yeah, there's also an interesting phenomenon too, right? Because when those 3 people you mentioned that are kind of your go-to kind of sources of truth there are interesting nodes in that network that other people can be aware of, that, okay, Jamie relies on these 3 people, so they have influence, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's really powerful for everyone to be aware of that and to know it. And that may not be reflected in the org chart. It may be, but often these informal pathways of information aren't, and I think it's really interesting to explore those, and it can be powerful to explore them as a team, right? If we're thinking about embarking on a change, doing some, we don't have to go heavy duty network analysis, but doing some lightweight analysis around who will be impacted by this change, or almost like racy kind of stuff, like who's responsible, accountable, all these kinds of things. But who are the people in the mix? And then also who do I work with often? Who do I know the least? Who has the most influence? These kinds of things. Kind of adding these layers of thinking around the people can really kind of shift how we might lean into the conversations or any of our next steps. And in fact, we made a template that's free for folks to download, which is for the express purpose of helping people have those little quick snapshots of their networks. So I'll send you a copy of that in case you want to share it around.
No, so how do you announce that to the team without announcing it? I mean, or do you just simply announce to the team, hey, these are the 3 people. If you have any questions, come to them. Don't come to me. Well, you obviously don't do that, right? Or how do you do
that? Yeah. That's a good question. I think it's going to depend a lot on the culture and a lot on the types of information you're gleaning from folks. I think it'd be interesting to hear. I'd love to hear from Jamie on how he approached it. But my thought would be, it can be helpful just to have some informal, like maybe making those 3 people aware of it. Hey, I'm leaning on you in this capacity. So in your relationships with everyone else, letting them know that you're a resource that they can come to could be powerful. So that way it kind of spreads organically. But I'm curious, Jamie, what did you found to be successful in your conversations?
No, I think that's exactly it, is having the relationship with those people and them knowing that, and not just for that one change, but for any change, they know that they're my eyes and ears when it comes to that certain group of people, and then them knowing it. And I think that, like you said, I think the word used was nodes. Like, I think people understand that, like, if there's lots of different people that I'm using for those things, but those are the people that are going to hear, I'm going to listen to, because I have meetings with them. Like, I have 3 meetings every week with 3 different groups of people, and those are the people I'm spending the time with to get that information. And that's the purpose of that meetings. And so I think the fact that they know that's the purpose of that meeting, they flow that information down to their group, right? So like we already talked about the trainers, I meet with the trainers for an hour every week, and that's the whole purpose of the meeting, is to get the feel of the accounting team, to get the feel of the accounting processes, to get the feel of what's going on within the accounting group. So they know that that's the purpose of that meeting. And so they're going to, prior to that meeting, they're going to want to come prepared. So they're going to talk to people. They're going to, go out and reach out to people and be like, hey, I haven't talked to this accountant for a while. Let's go see how they're doing and see if they have any information I can bring to Jamie next Wednesday when that meeting happens. So that's exactly what you said. That's how I approach it.
So I mean, kind of switching gears a little bit with change itself. We've got the economic conditions aren't the best right now. I think we can all agree upon that. And there's going to be a lot of change coming down the road here. It could be a short term, it could be a long term. Douglas, how do you deal with this change, or how do you convey this information to your team without really getting them overly excited or have high anxiety with it.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. As a leader, I've found that transparency is really important, but we also don't want to obsess over things to the point where it's distracting and debilitating for folks. And I think, to me, it's a matter of understanding each individual, and what their thresholds are and what their strengths are, and leaning into their strengths and say, like, for instance, if someone is really strong in the kind of as an arranger, I might say, hey, this is the way things are right now. This is the situation we're in, and I think your skills could be really helpful to help us navigate these next steps in X, Y, or Z ways. So, as an arranger, you might be able to help us put these pieces in place. And so, to me, it's always about, like, hey, what resources do we have? How can we reuse our relationships and really lean in together to make the best of the situation we're in? And then, and then also, I mean, fact of the matter is, there's already companies that have had to make layoffs. There will be companies making layoffs, and I think the thing there is always, how do we lean into that with humility, with humanity and grace? We've definitely seen folks on the news that have done that poorly, and I think really just being there for people in a time that's super difficult and emotional, and how do we support them, even if because the other thing we have to keep in mind is that might be a move that a company has to make, and it might be scary as the people left, because it's like, wow, we got a big hill to climb here, but taking care of those people and putting relationships first is going to help out more than anything. So it's not about, like, cutting it loose and then just like, okay, how do we just keep on it? Like, taking the requisite amount of time to make sure they're taken care of. And that the team that anyone that's left there is also heard and taken care of, because that's going to be a big change for them. Like, I'll often tell people, sometimes it's worse to be the person who's left behind, because you're now doing 2 or 3 people's jobs. And so, that's an important conversation to have, and to say, how do we who are still here lean in together and navigate this? Yeah. And the other thing too, aside from, even if companies aren't at that point having to deal with that, there's still so much uncertainty that we're leaning into right now. And I think it's important to have those conversations. And because I think the age of the super strong leader that has it all figured out is over. And we had to come in with curiosity. We had to include, ask people to bring their best selves, and, hey, what are you noticing? What do you think we could do? And at that point, we're in it together. It's not just like, I'm not the victim of someone making weird decisions, right? And so even if we got it wrong together. And I think you get a lot more resiliency on the team.
I think I've been a CFO consultant now for both a recession and a COVID
Right.
scare. And I think what we really learned during that time is be prepared. I think that's, we spent a lot of time when COVID hit was sitting down with our clients and being like, okay, let's talk best case scenario,
Yep.
worst case scenario, and let's just plop something in the middle there. And then let's have decisions for all 3 scenarios. Okay. So if it's best case scenario, awesome, nothing changes. If it's worst case scenario, we're going to have to get rid of 5 people. What are the 5 people that make the most sense? Or maybe we can get rid of 3 people and stop using this
Yep.
program, or let's come up with what that worst case scenario is. And then in the middle, what happens there? And then you're ready for when you see those scenarios and you have those trigger points, right? So if let's just say we have 3 months in a row of $300,000 of revenue, guess what? That's the worst worst case scenario for us, we're going to need to take that step. And so you're ready to take that step. And I think the other part that I think goes with that is not only having leadership be prepared, but having your team be aware. And that's something that needs to start now, right? Like if you've never shown your company your financial statements and they have no clue how the company does, then they're in the dark, right? Where if they actually see that every month and they say, oh, this is what it looks like when we're operating good, and they can start to see the downward trends, and you can say, hey, we're going down right now. We're going to have to start thinking about things we can do in order to keep this business going. Or things are going great. I know the economy's bad, but guess what? We're still doing really well. And so I think information is power. And so I think having those conversations with your team and not just your leadership is really important from what I've seen from consulting with companies on the finance
100%. I love the everything's good, everything's bad, everything's great, or or bad, worstest, like these different scenarios, really powerful. And I've always been a fan of, ever since my early days in startups, having models where we've got levers that we can go, okay, uncheck these things off, flip this on or off, and look at this, and it's like, oh man, this is not looking good. What are we going to do? And there's actually a tool that I'm a big fan of called critical uncertainties. And it's unfortunately it's a 2x2. So not all consulting tools are 2x2s, but quite a few of them are. So but the way this works is you think about things that are both critical for the outcome. So what we're talking about now is the finances, right? Like how much revenue can we generate, and then also maybe our ability to control costs would be two of them, right? And so you'd say we're able to tightly control our costs. We're not able to tightly control our costs. We have a lot of revenue. We have a little revenue, and we basically can creates 4 quadrants, right? And so we look at those combinations and think, what would we do in those scenarios? But the beauty of the tool is like you can dream up all sorts of things that are critical that we don't know the outcome of, that's about to happen on the horizon. And we can kind of peer into those intersections and say, what might we do if this combination of scenarios were to happen? And if you take it a step further and you look across the different quadrants of where you came up with the strategies that you might deploy if those things were to come to fruition, you can look across them and say, what things are similar across all of them? Then those are our robust strategies, right? We want to do those regardless. And then there might be things that you're like, man, that's a really good one. And that's worth doing, even if this doesn't happen, right? Like that's a hedging strategy. Let's do that regardless. And I think that not enough conversation is spent on these kind of exploring these kind of hypothetical things that might happen around the corner. I mean, sure, we talk about them of like, hey, what if this happens? And there's dialogue around it. This tool is a great way to kind of codify it down into like, okay, if A and B or B and C or D and E, you're kind of like comparing these different potential outcomes and what might we do can really help people rationalize about these future states.
No, I love that because, again, data is really important, right? Data helps you make an irrational decision into a rational decision. You're making a decision based on what your gut feeling is, which is, good or bad, versus what the data actually is showing you. And that, I think that's what, I think adding the data, adding the information, breaking them into the 4 quadrants, I think is the perfect way of going about it. And I think it has to be done on a frequent basis. It shouldn't be done just once a quarter, once a month. I think it should be done pretty much on a regular basis. Hey, what happens if this happens? You're constantly looking at that information and constantly making those decisions. And like you said, you may come up with a solution that would be great now versus waiting until the situation actually happens. I think that's the power of having someone sitting next beside you and really kind of guiding you and helping you make those real informed decisions.
I also think there's comfort in the information, right? So like I think a lot of times that people go into this being like, oh no, we're going to have a recession, right. And their thoughts go to, I'm going to have to lay off half my employees, or we're going to have to shut down 3 locations. Where once you actually do the modeling out, you're like, okay, worst case scenario, we're going to have to get rid of 3 people. I think a lot of times when you see the actual data, it's not as bad as you think. And that was so evident during COVID. Like 9 times out of 10, like we were either in the better tier or the middle tier. And I think a lot of companies, like when the word COVID started to become popular, companies were freaked out. They're like, what does this mean? What is this? How much revenue are we going to lose? How many people are we going to have to lose? Once you actually did the math, it wasn't that bad. So with that said, we're right at time here. So I'm going to give both the podcasters here a chance for a final thought. So I'll start with you, Douglas. Final thoughts.
I think that thing you just ended on is really powerful. We have to have models for change. And that point I made earlier around visualizing what's happening, because we've got those folks that are eager for change, those people that are worried about change, and maybe the people that are just freaked out and they don't know what to think. And so the more we can model the outcomes, understand where we're heading, like paint that picture of that roadmap, the more clarity we can get, the more that can reduce fears and uncertainty, and we can all get on a level playing field and have a real solid conversation around what it is. So I think that's really key, is how do we model the change?
Yeah, Douglas, how is someone going to get a hold of you? I mean,
Jody?
You've talked a lot about change, and I think everybody really needs you on their team in some manner. How do they reach out to you at all, and how do they get a hold of you?
Yeah, they can find Voltage Control at voltagecontrol.com. And I'm really active on LinkedIn if people want to check me out there. I post all my blogs and my podcast there, and and hopefully we can share that template and some other resources in the show notes as well.
Yeah, this has been great, Douglas. I mean, I've from the very beginning, change has been something that I think is super important for a company, and if companies don't change over time, they go stagnant. And I think what you brought to light is just a big part of that. You've got to be constantly looking for the right change, and then you've got to be able to bring that change to the team in a manner that they can then take the ball and run with it. Really, I mean, you don't want to be scared of change, and you just want to be able to embrace it. And I think that's what at least that's what I've heard from you. And I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth there, but I think that's so important for an organization to embrace change like you've done, in really all facets of the company.
Great. Well, definitely appreciate Jody. Appreciate Douglas. I think this is a great show. I know I learned a lot, and excited to go talk to some of my companies and say, hey, don't be afraid of change. Let's do this. So appreciate you guys.
Enjoy this podcast? Visit our website at summitcpa.net to get more tips and strategies for achieving business success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.